to becoming a millionaire. Bob Brown met a man who made that big leap, and if it sounds like the perfect plot for a Hollywood movie, now it is one.
It's your life, and suddenly the pace of it changes. Suddenly, one of the biggest movie stars in the world is acting it out, and Will Smith is playing Chris Gardner.
I noticed he was looking at me kind of like this. He had begun to study me. Now that made me uncomfortable. I had never been studied before, okay?
But if you're Chris Gardner, you have no complaints. Gardner used to be homeless, and on rare occasions, he holed up in this public bathroom with his infant son.
It was a choice. You eat or you stay in the hotel. We chose to eat. We stayed in the subway station. We rode the trains. We slept in bathrooms.
Then, after getting himself into a training program and proving he could keep company with the best of them, he became a multimillionaire stockbroker.
Come on, man.
It was one amazing ride, a story we told you 3.5 years ago.
All right, I'll talk to you.
And in the days just after the story was broadcast on 2020, Chris Gardner fielded a lot of weird offers related to his rise from homelessness to wealth, including a proposal for a reality show.
Guy calls me up. He's got this great idea. He's going to take some homeless people off the street, give them a job, and the one that does the most with their life is going to get a $300,000 house, $100,000 in cash, and all this other good stuff. And I can't repeat what I said to the guy, but the gist of it was, being homeless is not a game, and if you think it is, I already won, so send me the money. Haven't heard from him again.
So this story is about how a life with much larger stakes than any reality show got turned into a screenplay expected to be in movie theaters this winter and into a book published this week, both called The Pursuit of Happiness, with the word happiness deliberately misspelled, just as it was on the wall of a daycare center when Gardner was seeking care for his son in their worst days. For a man who is now in many ways a larger-than-life figure,
I'm afraid of not being happy.
his story began in a Milwaukee neighborhood with a kind of mystery. Why a woman with an incredible smile, a woman who turned out to be his mother, sometimes went missing.
And no one explained to me, well, why am I living with this relative, or why am I living with that relative?
Why was your mother missing?
My mother was in prison twice. And it was one of those things that no one ever talked about.
And she was in prison because?
First time, allegedly receiving welfare while working. And the second time, she attempted to burn down the house that my stepfather was sleeping in. She wanted to kill him for beating her. And I can say honestly, I'm sorry she didn't succeed. And before I said no.
Later in his life, Gardner was heavily influenced by decisions he and his mother made, sometimes with just a look between them, when he was terrorized by his gun-wielding stepfather.
He would come out with a shotgun, you wrote?
My last Christmas at home, man, I was put out of the house, butt naked, at gunpoint. Till this day, I still have a problem with Christmas. But I made a decision that I was going to be everything that this guy was not. I'm not going to drink, and I'm not going to beat women. I'm not going to be ignorant. And one of the tactics that I developed as a young kid, I would read, and I'd read out loud, and I would be saying to this guy, yeah, you can beat me down, you can beat me, you can beat my mom, you can put us out of here with a gun, but I can read, and I'm going places.
In one of the worst events of Gardner's childhood, an incident he never discussed, he was raped by a man who was a member of a gang of thieves in his neighborhood, and he had nowhere to turn.
I don't know how any rape victim survives something like that, but I believe if you talk to them, a lot of us do block it off. And at some point in time, I did have an encounter with that gentleman. I expressed myself another way.
You hit him with a cinder block.
I did. And walked away. And left the whole incident right there on the street.
What got Gardner out of his neighborhood was the Navy. After 4 years of duty, he was a kid without a college degree, but who valued reading and who learned quickly. He became a medical supply salesman in the San Francisco area, supporting a wife and a young son. But he reached another turning point in his life when, in a parking lot one day, he met a man who drove a red Ferrari.
And I asked him 2 questions that basically changed my life. What do you do? And how do you do that? Turns out this gentleman was a stockbroker who was making $80,000 a month.
That was all the motivation Gardner needed to start knocking on doors, applying to become a trainee at a brokerage, even though it meant he would have to leave his steady income job. Then things started to get bad. He was hauled off to jail for parking violations that he couldn't afford to pay. His wife left him, and after he then moved into an Oakland boarding house, she asked him to take over care of their young son. Although he was living on next to nothing as a brokerage trainee, Gardner, haunted by his stepfather's abuse, was determined not to abandon his child.
Growing up hearing constantly, quote, "I am not your daddy," with a few other words thrown in there. I made a decision when I was a little boy that when I grow up and when I had children, my children were always going to know who their father is.
The bottom line, Gardner's wife had left, the boarding house where he had stayed wouldn't accept children, and as he struggled for a brokerage job, his subsistence income wasn't enough for him and his son. So when Gardner brought his son home from daycare each night to the cheap hotels he could occasionally afford, he got help from unexpected sources.
By the time we were coming home, the ladies of the evening were beginning their shift, and they would always see myself, this baby, and the stroller. They never saw a woman, so they kind of figured out something's going on. So they started giving them $5 bills. And if it were not for those ladies of the evening giving their child $5, there would be times I could not have fed him.
Occasionally, he found a place to stay here, in a nearby Bay Area rapid transit station, where he could bathe his son in the sink and lock the door when they needed time. He says they were some of the darkest days of his life, but his life was about to turn.